Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Kate Folb. I'm Director of Hollywood Health and Society, and we are delighted today to be presenting this Lunch and Learn titled One Last Trip, Psychedelics and Dreams at the End of Life. For those who may not know us, Hollywood Health and Society is a free resource to the entertainment industry on all aspects of health, medicine, science, safety, and security. Currently, we've been working with the Endwell Project for a while and helping to expand the narrative around end of life on TV. If you're like me, you're used to seeing basically two ways of dying on television. One is getting murdered, and one is peacefully falling asleep, usually in a hospital bed. And when we know that there are many, many other ways that people die. So if after today's discussion, you're inspired to write about end of life or psychedelics or dreams or any of the topics discussed today, we can connect you with these panelists or other experts to help inform your scripts. So as the discussion goes on today, if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen anytime it occurs to you. And we will try to do our best to get to them toward the end of the panel discussion. We'll also post the bios of our speakers in the chat so that we don't have to spend a lot of time introducing, and everybody has so many credentials that it would take the whole hour just to get through their credentials. So please check the chat if you want to know more about our speakers. Now let's get to the good stuff, and let me introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Shoshana Ungerleider. Welcome, Shoshana.
Thank you so much, Kate. Welcome, everybody. As Kate mentioned, I'm Dr. Shoshana Ungerleider. I'm the founder of Endwell, and we're a nonprofit focused on making end of life a part of life. I'm a practicing internal medicine physician and the host and producer of TED Health. And it's really my honor to get to moderate this groundbreaking virtual discussion on how psychedelics and the mystical invite new stories at end of life. And today, we've gathered an esteemed group of storytellers, of content creators and advocates, even though I can't see you all, I know you're out there, to tackle an incredibly poignant and pressing issue, which is the portrayal of psychedelics and other mystical experiences in media, especially as these narratives intersect with the journey toward the end of life. And our distinguished panel includes New York Times bestselling author and journalist, Michael Pollan, the creator, writer, and producer of ABC's A Million Little Things, DJ Nash, and palliative care physician, co-founder of Mental Health, author and my friend, Dr. BJ Miller. And at the heart of our discussion is a really profound yet often overlooked truth, and that is that we as a society, we run away from death. We don't think about it, we don't talk about it, and we certainly don't plan for it. And I can tell you as a physician how this plays out is that far too many people receive care at the end of their lives that they don't want, they don't understand, and this leads people and their families to suffer needlessly and often doesn't honor the life that they've lived. Many individuals also face existential distress as they approach the end of their lives. And sadly, modern medicine really lacks adequate treatments to alleviate this deep-seated anguish. And the treatments that we do have don't really allow people to live fully until they die. Now, we're at an interesting moment in time where psychedelic-assisted therapy research and education is finally getting the attention it deserves after being sidelined for over 40 years. Research has shown that it has the potential to offer significant relief for people facing a life-limiting illness, but we have a lot more work to do. So today, we explore the transformative potential of storytelling, talking about these potentially life and death-altering therapies, not just in clinics and research, but in the stories that we see on our screens. how can television and film more accurately and empathetically represent these mystical experiences? The stories that we tell matter. They shape perceptions, they can alter stigmas, and they invite viewers into the profound depths of human experience. So, as we discuss the spiritual and emotional and familial dimensions of dying, let us remember that death itself can be a teacher. It urges us to stay awake to our lives, allowing each of us hopefully to live better every day if we let it in. So with that, let's jump in. Michael, I'd love for you to briefly set the stage here and provide a little context for those who might be unfamiliar. I sort of alluded to this, but we know that many clinical studies have demonstrated that psilocybin, the active component of magic mushrooms, taken under controlled conditions with clinical guidance, produces significant and lasting positive effects for people facing terminal illness. So in addition to reducing anxiety and depression, it also improves death acceptance and life meaning and optimism. So from a neuroscientific perspective, what are the mechanisms by which that we think psychedelics alleviate this existential distress for people?
Thank you, Shoshana. Very good to be here and to be able to address this particular audience. I want to back up a little before I try to answer the neuroscientific question, for which I'm completely unprepared. But I have some thoughts about that too. So my introduction to the world of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy came in 2014 when I first read about a kind of astonishing trial underway at Johns Hopkins and NYU, where terminal cancer patients were receiving high-dose psilocybin. When I first heard about this, I thought it was the strangest idea. I couldn't imagine why anyone facing that eventuality would want to give up control in a way that taking psychedelics involves. So I decided to write about it, and I wrote a piece for the New Yorker, which you can search on my website or online. It's called The Trip Treatment, where I dug into this experiment and interviewed probably a dozen participants in it. And it was this experience of meeting these people, facing, most of them suffering from what you correctly described as existential distress. Most of them were terminal. Some of them, though, had been paralyzed by the fear of recurrence of their cancer, this sense that the other shoe was about to drop, and that had paralyzed them. And my interactions with these people and discussions were just so moving and so powerful and so mysterious, because here were people whose metaphysics, their whole idea of death and what happened after death, if anything, was transformed in the course of an afternoon. And they emerged from this experience, in most cases, with an astonishing equanimity about their death. That was so mind-blowing and inexplicable to me that I then launched on writing my book, How to Change Your Mind, which involved my having a bunch of psychedelic experiences, hoping to get to the kernel of this. But it is the most moving application, I think, of psychedelics, and probably the most successful, although we'll see. How does it work? I would venture, and this is only that, we don't really have enough basic science to say, but people on a psychedelic experience at a high dose often go through a process that, could be called a mystical experience, could be called ego dissolution. These are just different vocabularies. One comes out of William James, the mystical experience. Another comes out of psychodynamic psychology, ego dissolution. But I think they're the same thing. There is a kind of death or transcendence of the self. And it is the self that we cling to, especially at death, and what we fear losing. And psychedelic experience gives you a preview of, or a rehearsal of the loss of self, because you experience it. And it's not so terrible. the self is a cage as well as this powerful adaptive tool that we have. And most of the people I interviewed had this experience of death of the self. And now, of course, in a psychedelic experience, you come back from it. And I think that colors people's thinking. But some people had experiences of an afterlife or a glimpse of something, some field of consciousness that would go on. But many people, and this is, I think, to me was the more striking, had a very naturalistic sense of what happened after death. I remember this one woman describing her experience on psilocybin as taking her all over the world and visiting all these capitals and ending up under the ground and herself dissolving and her atoms being taken up by plants. Now, that's a very naturalistic description of what happens after death, but she could identify with those molecules and those plants in a way she formerly had identified with herself. Neuroscientifically, the best theory we've had, but it's not completely uncontroversial yet, is that a particular brain network called the default mode network, which we know is involved in self-referential thought, theory of mind, self-evaluation, time travel, all these components that go into our sense of self, appears to be disorganized or disintegrated during a high dose psychedelics. And that might explain, if you want a material explanation, what exactly is happening. But I would just say that it is this sense, this temporary loss of self and transcendence of it that appears to be what gives people relief.
Thank you for that. BJ Miller, to you, from your experience as a palliative care doctor, can you tell us how your patients' attitudes towards death may have changed after experiencing psychedelic therapy?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Shoshana. And hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. Glad we're having this conversation. There's a lot here. So Shoshana, to your question, do you mean what have I observed in people sort of pre-post one of these experiences in patients and others that I've served? Yeah, it's very telling. I mean, Michael's description is very apt, and a theme that you see variations on one way or another. Sometimes it feels like they're describing a sort of right sizing of themselves. Sometimes it feels like they're describing, a lot of folks that I talk with have ideas about themselves in the world and the world around them and what might happen after they're gone, but it stays up in this sort of cognitive, intellectual space. Oftentimes what I'll see folks after these experiences is some deeper kind of knowing. It's not that they had an epiphany per se, it's that they feel this truth of our connection that is timeless in some way that you can't escape. I mean, like it's like we are connected. If you don't feel that, then something's in the way. There's a truth of connection that people describe feeling. And that you can imagine, it's sort of like a mattress or a net or something that you get to fall into. So there's this, so that felt non-intellectual sense, that inner knowing, can be very palpable and very reassuring to folks. Anxiety and neuroses. Neuroses sounds pathological. I don't want to do that. I mean, these are sort of natural experiences we have. Our brains really can gum us up. And illness and diagnosis and the treatments that go with it and just the time constraints, et cetera, and really push a person around. And so to have some felt sense that there's something beyond your own experience, that you're part of something larger, et cetera, it's sort of an anti-loneliness maker. It's a right sizer. It's an aesthetic experience that allows us to enjoy having a body, this natural thing that is the thing we're going to lose, at least. So anyways, those are some answers to your question. And oftentimes it's not really the stuff of words. I'll
Mm.
see it on a person's face. Because sometimes I've seen folks after these experiences come in looking like 10 years younger. I don't know how to explain that. There's a lot I don't need to explain. I don't need to say that probably. But so there's some loosening, lightening affect level that may have no word for it, but you can sense it in a person.
Yeah. And Michael, I want to come back to you. We touched on the neuroscience a little bit. Can you elaborate on how, because we have an audience of storytellers, right? How they might use the understanding of how psychedelic experiences mitigate the fear of death, or how we believe it to. How can they use that understanding in their stories? And then DJ, if you have thoughts on this too, after Michael, I'd love for you to comment.
I don't really know. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to do it. I found the testimony of individuals describing their story very powerful, and I'm a little loath to attempt to literally depict these experiences using special effects, which is the temptation. How do you depict the dissolution of self? I had such an experience myself. And here's what it looked like. I somehow saw myself, but I shouldn't say I, because there was no I left, but some new perspective beheld a detonation of what I was into a cloud of blue Post-it notes, which then, trickled down to the ground and formed a pool of blue paint. You wouldn't want to go too literal on that. And too specific. I think you need to leave space for people to imagine what the loss of their own sense of self would feel like. I want to second something BJ said, is that there's something about the psychedelic experience that takes insight or knowledge out of the cognitive intellectual space and puts it in the heart. People describe this as realer than real. It is a felt conviction that that something might happen after death. And William James talked about that. He called it the noetic quality, the sense that during a mystical experience, which is what we're describing, what is learned, what is glimpsed, is not just an opinion or an insight, it's a revealed truth. And so whatever insights you have, that there's something greater than my sense of self, that this sense of merging, and I didn't say this earlier and should have, but when the sense of self shrinks or disappears, there's nothing between us and something larger. And that larger could be other people and love, that larger could be nature, that larger could be the universe. And so when the walls of self come down, there's no distinction. And that experience is ecstatic for many people. Not for everybody. The point also should be kept in mind is, like, some people don't have good experiences. And it seems like it is the resistance to surrendering to what is happening that makes people very anxious. And there is this need to give up control, to surrender. And surrender is a word you'll hear a good psychedelic guide use quite a bit. And of course, that's exactly what has to happen at the moment of death too. And so there's a rehearsal not only for the loss of self, but a rehearsal of surrendering all that you know about experience to this unknown, which for many people could be the psychedelic experience or death. So I don't know that helps you exactly with storytelling. I found that people's words were for me the most persuasive way to do it. And I would just be a little wary of trying to go too literal with this.
Yeah. And DJ, anything to add there?
Well, first, a disclaimer that I'm not smart enough to be on this panel, just to put that out there. I mean, Michael, drugs are tax deductible. You found a way to make drugs tax deductible. So that's very impressive. That's super, like, that just is brilliant. in the writing I've done, and I've looked at both the survivor of a loved one to death and then someone going through that experience, I have been really fascinated about what you all have talked about this idea of letting go or giving in. The analogy I would use is if you've torn your rotator cuff and you try to move your arm, you don't have as much mobility because your brain tells you it's going to hurt and stops you. When you're under anesthesia, you actually have more flexibility than you do when you're awake because that governor isn't there. And I wonder, and the stuff that I'm writing now looks at this idea of, the practical side of us, is that keeping us from accepting a reality that as we near death or as we die, we might be able to accept? And so I'm fascinated. It's sort of the journey that the psychedelics can take one on. And it may be suspending your inhibition or, again, giving in, as Michael said. So the project I'm working on right now looks at all of this. And, I lost my dad 4 years ago. And 5 years ago, if you said to me, like, do you want to go see a psychic? Do you want to go connect? I would say, oh, we could do that, or we could just set $200 on fire, because that's the same thing. But since then, there are these moments that have happened. And I wrote about, we did an episode of A Million Little Things that looked at that with Gary's dad and some dreams he had. But there's been moments that have happened that I go, I'm not sure I believe, but I know I don't not believe. That's where I am.
Yeah. And so building on that, BJ, talking more broadly about mystical experiences now, we know that as people approach the end of their lives, some may have these vivid dreams or visions. And so these can, include themes of maybe preparation for travel or being welcomed by loved ones who've already died. For many, I think these dreams can provide comfort and impart a sense of peace, or even help kind of resolve unfinished business for people. Tell us about a time in your practice where you witnessed any dreams or visions reported by patients that, it impacted them or their family's experience of the dying process.
Well, you're making me think, Shoshana, about, I wonder if you've had this experience too. I mean, what I learned, we'll come at your question a couple different ways. One is, when I learned this craft of hospice and palliative medicine and how to treat symptoms, how to ease suffering, I started looking at what I was trained to do. And it's probably not surprising, the more you understand the sort of Western medical model, is more, at best, I could numb somebody a little bit, throw a wet blanket on their nervous system. These are very different responses to someone who's having a crisis of meaning or questioning the stability of their or the sort of their own view of life. It's they may materialize. They may look as though they're anxious, and so we give you Valium or something and just kind of numb you out. That is not the same thing as providing someone access or opening a portal to them either answering their own questions or being okay without an answer. So just part of my answer here is a little bit of a confession as I look back in my earlier days in this practice. So terminal delirium, visions right out of the chutes, I've already kind of revealed. That's a diagnosis. It sounds like pathology, delirium. So we've kind of categorically said to folks who are nearing the end of life, and especially in the final days when delirium and visions and hallucinations and our grip on sort of reality per se start shifting. In the past, we used to call that, a problem and, give you Haldol essentially, or Sercal or some drug to just kind of zap that. And I wondered, again, here a little bit of a confession, I wonder how many times I accidentally, really at just the wrong moment, interrupted a very vital process for someone because it looked messy or chaotic or something that I was uncomfortable with. So I think about that one a lot, Shoshana. But more recently, to your point, now these visions, these dreams I treat them as themselves as perhaps something of value, not mine necessarily to give or take away. If the person's conscious enough, if there's time to discuss those dreams, that can be very, very fertile ground. A lot can be evinced, and you can kind of pull themes, and you can name some things. And after a conversation, folks can feel really kind of after some reflection on those dreams, there might be some meaning for them. And that's not mine as a physician to impart. Again, that's mine to kind of reflect with them and them to say. So back to your question, there's a real range. If there's a potential if this person is still communicative and we can talk about those dreams, there's a lot of meaning to mine in them. I want to just, again, sort of final days, one more thing to note here is, and maybe it's useful to distinguish these sort of dreams from delirium, because it's also true that at the end of life, I've worked with families and people who are one way their whole lives are in their deathbed and haven't been awake for a day or two or three, and then have this sort of moments of lucidness and breaking through. And sometimes families have reported that their husband of 60 years who never said a hard word to them woke up, and the final thing they said to the spouse or loved one is something horrible, like, I hated you and never loved you, dead. Like, whoa. So, I want to be careful. There's a lot we're talking about here. I want to be careful to distinguish. I don't know when something is pathological or constructive. It's hard to know. And very often I have also found myself comforting families by saying, you know what, ma'am, I don't think your husband knew what he was saying. I think that was delirium. I think you need to hold those last words with a real big grain of salt. So my answer to your question is evolving or drifting here a little bit, Shosh, but I want to kind of give this landscape as the medical side of things as a real judgment call, when to quiet something down, when to explain it away, and when to let it roll. And frankly, I'm not always clear when to do which.
Well, and for the comedy writers out there, there's maybe a little dark humor in that,
Oh, for sure.
Story.
I mean, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
All sorts of things get said, not just gnarly things, but hilarious things and all sorts of stuff.
There's some speculative science that there is an endogenous psychedelic, DMT, and that the effects of DMT resemble near-death experience effects, and that there are people who believe, and there's a lot more research that needs to be done. It's very hard to measure chemicals in the brain, especially at these levels, but that may be released at moments of crisis or near death, and might account for the psychedelic-like experiences people have. One other thing we haven't talked about too is the context in which these drugs are administered.
That was exactly my next question.
Oh, good. Okay.
So go for it. This idea of intention setting at the outset and integration and the whole framework around it, I think, briefly is very important for this. Yeah.
So forgive me if people know all this, but when psychedelics are used in a therapeutic context, they don't just give you a pill. It's very contextual. Building on Timothy Leary's insight, going back to the early 60s, set and setting, the physical setting and the mindset that people bring to the experience powerfully influences what happens. These are highly unpredictable drugs in their effects. And that the effects have as much to do with what's already going on in your mind than the chemistry. And so people are prepared very carefully for this. There's often several sessions, many hours, before the drug is administered to people in a clinical setting in the underground, where this also takes place. It would be more likely to be one person sits with you the whole time, is not directing the experience, really just allowing it to unfold as it's going to unfold, but there to give you a comforting, hand on the, handhold or hand on the shoulder if it gets really gnarly. Usually there's a setting of intention in those before you take the substance, and sometimes the experience reflects that intention. Sometimes it takes you totally somewhere else. But it's really going to, whatever happens, and this is a question that came up, and people would ask me, like, so what's the truth quotient of the experience this person had? This person had an experience that there is something that goes on after death. And I would ask the researchers, what do you make of that? And they would usually say, they'd cop out and they say, that's beyond my pay grade. But whatever happens is not the product of the chemical. It's the product of the mind, that person's mind. And some people are wired for a different vision of death than others. So the experience is guided. There are these two people there sitting with you. You're lying down, you're listening to music. Music's a very important part of this. You can go on Spotify and listen to some of the playlists that are used. The Johns Hopkins playlist is a beautiful one, although it's very dead white male and kind of churchy. NYU has another playlist that's a little more hip and modern and spatial, and Steve Reich and, you know, Brian Eno inflected. So there are very different ways to go. But the music has a powerful influence on the experience that is hard to credit, but you hear music in a way you've never heard it before. And then after the experience, there is an integration session. And this is because sometimes the experience is very confusing and inchoate, and lots happens. There's huge amounts of material that needs to be processed. And integration is often not done that well, or is kind of cursory. It's a couple hours, but it could go on for months because there's so much there to work on. And people often need help narrativizing it, taking an experience that had many dimensions and finding a line through it that is useful to them and addresses the issues that they're most concerned about.
Thank you, Michael. And so, BJ, in your practice, have you observed the impact of psychedelic therapy on family dynamics as a patient approaches the end or even after they've died? And can you tell us a story about that if you have one?
Oh, lots. I mean, especially at the end of life. I mean, a lot of these experiences, you know, many of us start worrying about death well in advance of our deathbed. So, you know, we're talking about a spectrum here of when these experiences can be helpful and transformative. But the ones that where folks who are, you know, the one having the experience is soon to be deceased, soon to be gone, then very often the work is with the family to make sense of that experience, to reflect on it, to bob and weave with the recriminations and regrets and guilts that so often want to come or try to come. So yeah, so very often. So to your question, Shosh, recently a friend of mine and I were involved with a family. And this man had the man who had requested a psychedelic experience before he died, and then since died, some weeks later. You know, he'd had a very difficult childhood, things he could never talk about with family or anybody else. He was beloved by his family, but not well understood. And you know how our suffering, we suffer together. I mean, my suffering is not just confined into me. People who care about me experience it empathetically. And so this man's childhood had a lot of impact on his family's life years down the road. And the wife attended this experience with the guide that we worked with and the person. And it was not it did not, you know, the trip itself, the experience itself was filled with what looked like pain. You know, it wasn't flowers, and it was not an easy experience. But when he emerged, there was, he described, and again, sort of just presented, not just the description, but described not really a reconciliation, but a peace with being at peace with the experiences, that they weren't torturing him anymore. They were just simply part of his experience, and he could hold his own story a little bit differently, and something loosened, and tears flowed like they hadn't for a long time, and emotions flowed, including sorrows and pain. Maybe it was you, Michael, said something about the resistance to our experience is so often the problem. And so he dropped a lot of his resistance. And then he died subsequently. And then we heard from the wife that this is one of the most meaningful things they had ever done together, that it put, I want to be leery of things like closure and something too tidy, but it really satisfied some things for her, and she got to see her husband at peace, or at least a modicum of them of peace, and she got to experience that empathetically, and it sent her into her grief in a very different valence. She was still sad as can all sorts of ways, but she didn't have to second guess a lot of things. She didn't have to wonder if her husband was okay. She didn't, a lot of her worries got to drip away, and she got to be just good old fashioned sad. And that was a success. That felt like a success. Just kind of what we've called clean sorrow.
Yeah.
It was lovely.
One of the things that happens is that the family sometimes is against the psychedelic experience because it represents to them giving up the fight. And, we're very invested in this fight against cancer, against death. And if someone says, I really want to explore, I don't want to turn my back on this thing that's happening to me, I want to face it through a psychedelic experience, that can be really disturbing to other people in the family. And the character that I focused on, a man named Patrick Metis, in my piece on this subject, his wife was really against him doing this initially and saw it as a giving up. And in fact, when that study was done, the oncologists, who would be the logical people to refer patients, absolutely refused. They too saw this as a rejection of Western medicine, of the fight. And it was only the nurses who fed patients to the researchers. I think that's changing. I think there are oncologists now who recognize the value of psychedelic experience for their patients. In fact, there is an oncology practice in the in Bethesda, Maryland. It's called Sunstone Therapies. You might want to check it out, where they're now offering psychedelic experience in addition to chemo and radiation and all the other things you expect. And I think that's the future. And they're getting very good results. But bringing the family around and along, I think, can be really an issue.
Yeah. DJ, okay, over to you. On A Million Little Things, you explored really complex emotional narratives throughout the many years the show was on. It started with someone dying by suicide, and then the show ends with medical aid in dying. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to do this?
Yeah. The first thing I want to say is that this day, I will never be the same because of this panel. Like tonight in bed, I'm going to say to my wife, we spent 25 years married. I've known you more than half my life. The kids, there are kids, but if the last moment I say, I always hated you and then die, I didn't mean it. I want to get ahead of that right now. I want you to know I didn't mean that. My goodness, that's horrific. Oh my goodness. Your question was about the show. I lost a friend to suicide, and his death was so unexpected. Like me, he was a dad. Like me, he was a husband, and he loved his wife and kids. At some point, our roads forked, and he lost his way. And writing that experience, whenever I start a show, I think about where are we going so that I have something to build to. And I realized his good friend had cancer, and so the disease of the depression and the disease of cancer to me were, I was running those and comparing those, and comparing the fact that, like, when you die after a battle with cancer, you can tell everyone and everyone's there and everyone gets it. And unfortunately, in our society, it's less now, but it's still there. There's a stigma where someone who lost someone who died by suicide, you don't feel like you can share that as openly. And there's this idea of death with dignity. I remember first seeing it in the 80s when a friend of mine's dad had a blood transfusion and then died of AIDS. And it was really unclear. Wait, why is he sick? What's happening? And she didn't feel like she could say that. And so I knew from the beginning I wanted a series that started with a death, a suicide that shouldn't have happened, to end with an assisted suicide, which was the morally correct thing to happen. And I wanted Gary to have a death with dignity. And so we were building to that all along. I knew that would cause many problems on network TV, especially because they lived in a state where it was against the law. And I was, it was a really amazing process. And as we have the show's called A Million Little Things. Friendship isn't a big thing; it's a million little things. Our fans were dubbed millionaires, and so this community of people who supported each other with mental health issues or with cancer battles or some of the many issues we talked about. I heard from a lot of them after the finale. There was a woman who wrote to me whose husband had breast cancer, and it went away, and then it came back, and he died. And she wrote me this beautiful letter about, I was really hoping you weren't going to do the Hollywood ending to the show. I hate to say, Gary was my favorite, and I used to watch the show with my husband, who's gone. And I just want to say thank you for telling the story the way, unfortunately, it sometimes happens. And those moments, I started in stand-up, and when people would come up after a show and joke about, oh, my wife does that thing you joked about, or I had a Snoopy snow cone machine or whatever, I'm still getting that about much more significant issues now. But to hear from a fan who was touched by that story and felt seen, that was so meaningful.
So DJ, as the writer on this panel, how might you approach incorporating a storyline involving psychedelics or the mystical you talked about your new show as a transformative experience for a character at the end of their life or not?
Well, to me, I think this was a little bit how I approached life before my dad died, which is like, what is this about? What am I trying? We're all just like, I read Siddhartha. What's going on here? Like we're all trying to figure out what's this journey, and when we die, are we going to get all the answers or just the odd ones in the back of the book? Like what's happening here? And since my dad's been gone, I have a clarity that I did not have before. And so for me personally, I have just sort of given in to writing about those experiences that have happened. I know we're talking about dreams at some point in the panel. Since my dad's gone, if I could have anything in the world, if I could have any single thing, it would be one more lunch. That's what I want. It's one more lunch. And since he's been gone, I've had these dreams that are so vivid, and I've had dreams my whole life. They almost feel like memories I forgot about, and they involve him. And every time I dream, I am aware that I'm dreaming. And I'll say to myself, you're dreaming, just go with it. I'm much more nurturing to myself in my dreams than I am awake. But I have had these experiences, and I heard BJ talk about this portal. And I will tell you that I really believe, A Million Little Things talked about everything happens for a reason. The challenge in life is figuring out that reason. So the friends, when their friend died by suicide, the challenge was like, what's the reason for this? And then what they discover at the end of the pilot is their other friend had pills in his mouth and was going to take his life, and this might be the reason. Since my dad's been gone, I go through this journey of what's the reason, and I've sort of given into this path. And I had this dream about this portal, and it's so interesting, BJ, to hear you talk. It's not a coincidence that we're on this panel and we're talking about this, but in this dream, I had this dream that when someone dies, as they cross over, it opens this portal where someone who has died can come back. And in the dream that I had, I remember saying to myself, "Oh, that's a great premise for a movie. Remember this." And the series that I'm doing now looks at this idea of a guy who stumbles into this portal, and he wonders, either A, I'm Cole from Sixth Sense, or I'm going crazy and I've been triggered by a trauma that I'm going through. And throughout the whole series, we don't know, and he doesn't know. But I love what you're talking about here about this, the analysis of dreams, and do we give in? Because there's a part of our rational side that, when we're not under anesthesia, we can't move our arm. And I love the idea of telling that. So for me as a storyteller, this has been a big part of my journey to accept and process the fact that my relationship with my dad isn't over, it's just changed. And I've given into that process now.
Beautiful. Michael, I want to zoom back out, and a lot of the work that you do is on this topic. I think, considering the significant historical stigma around psychedelics up until pretty much a few years ago, what role do you think that traditional media has played in shaping public perceptions of psychedelics, and what changes really would you like to see?
Well, I think we've been in, the media follows a pendulum swinging pattern often, and we've had a very positive press around psychedelics for the last 5 or 6 years. And this has had both positive and negative effects. It's led to a lot more funding for psychedelic research, which is still largely privately supported, private philanthropy. There's very little federal money, National Institute of Health money, which is a shame because it's very promising work. But, as the media tends to do, it kind of is overselling. There's a lot of overselling of psychedelics, I think, right now. The pendulum is going to switch at some point, and there will be a lot of negative stories about psychedelics because so many people are using them. Many people are using them in a very reckless way, nothing like the protocol I described earlier with the preparation and guiding and integration. So I'm concerned about that. We had a backlash once before in the 60s where psychedelics were being used recklessly, and the public and then eventually the government turned against them and halted this very promising line of research. We already had good evidence back in the 50s and 60s that you had an important treatment here for things like alcoholism in particular. And it just stopped cold, and we had 20, 30 years with nothing happening. And so I don't want to see that happen again. But I think that the media portrayal is it could be a little more sober and than it has been. The other thing I see in some media portrayals, and I forget the name of this show, but I'm sure most of the people listening know it, where there was a guide or a kind of guru giving people psychedelics without their permission.
The
What was that
Nicole
one?
Kidman show.
Yeah, yeah.
9 Perfect Strangers or something like
Nine
that.
Perfect Strangers.
Yeah.
So, that happened in the 60s. People were being dosed without their knowledge. I can think of few things more cruel than dosing people with psychedelics without their knowledge. The whole idea of putting it in the punch bowl was a meme from the 60s. And it really happened. I mean, the Grateful Dead were dosing everybody around them very actively. But I think that that's just horrible idea, and it was so I think that kind of thing. People writing about it should look at how it is actually used and deployed in a therapeutic context, or even in a religious or spiritual context, because there are different contexts, and we haven't talked about that. I mean, there is this medical container for psychedelics that's been developed. It actually grows out of the underground. But there is also a religious container. There are several religious groups that have the constitutional right to use psychedelics, and there will be more in the future. I think religion and religious ritual provides another container that's somewhat different, but gets at the point that you need a container. And taking these drugs out of a container is a recipe for disaster.
We're about to get to the Q&A. I do have one more question for DJ. Knowing that this is largely an audience of your peers, in writing for television. So in A Million Little Things, you've woven really complex, the intense, like emotional narratives all over the place. It's beautiful. What would you say to someone who thinks that talking about death and illness is just too sad to engage in, to engage audiences on primetime television?
Oh, wow. Respectfully disagree. In my real life, not in TV writing, some of the times I've laughed the hardest have been in and around funerals, or in and around people dying. I remember my dad's cousin, who was like the matriarch of our family. She would make it to every wedding. She would drive to like, she just like, it's 2,000 miles. I'll be there tomorrow. Like she was always showed up. She fell at home and it was 24 hours before someone discovered her. And her directive was, I don't want to live like that. So we all gathered around her bed as she had her last days. And my dad, who was blind since he was 12, I take him down to see his cousin and to visit with his cousin. And he's telling this story about her. And he goes, I remember when Bryna, and he's telling this story and he's getting it wrong. And the reason I know he's getting it wrong is because Bryna is shaking her right leg so strong. Like she's like, and I'm like, Dad, I don't think it was in North Carolina. I think it was in Massachusetts. No, I know. And I was like, and what he doesn't realize is she can't talk. She's all but gone, but she's listening to the story and she's objecting to the fact that her cousin got the story wrong. And it was so funny. It was just so funny because yeah, she's going to die and that's fine. But it was not North Carolina. It was Massachusetts. So to me, those moments, and the last things that the guys said to Gary, there are these moments where we laugh because we need to stop crying. And for me, our formula on the show was always, if you think this is a moment that's going to make you cry, I want to make you laugh. And if you think this is a moment that's going to make you laugh, I'm going to try to make you cry. So I think hopefully the compliment our show has received that means the most to me is it felt authentic. And I think it's because people thought these people were real. And what really happens is you cry when you're supposed to be laughing sometimes, and you laugh when you're supposed to be crying.
Yeah. So true. We have so many amazing questions. We're not going to get to all of them. We may run over a little bit here. So if you have to drop, that's okay. Michael asks a question. The paradox for much of storytelling is the illumination of the ineffable. We've talked a little bit about this. These mysterious inner experiences increase the stretch by an order of magnitude. Can you talk about the various ways that writers historically have shed light on unpenetrable mystery? What do they do? Multimedia tricks, poetry, how is this done? That's a question.
I think it's done with metaphor. I think historically that's how it's done. That you find the right metaphor for something. Metaphors are very mysterious. They have an explanatory value that's very hard to put in words. So finding the right metaphor for an experience, and that could be, of course, a word. It could be an image. But that's what I look for in my own writing, is a great metaphor. It's also a shortcut. There are amazingly efficient ways to get ineffable ideas across.
Can I just tag in on that too?
Yes.
I so agree with what you're saying. And when the question was asked, I was like, oh, I hope it doesn't go to me because I don't even know what it means. But then you explained it. When my friend died and I was trying to figure out how this could have happened, like, why does he take his life? Like, how does this happen? I remember the morning of his memorial, I wrote something down, and it was this idea that John F. Kennedy Jr., when he was going to Martha's Vineyard on that fateful trip, he left later than he should have. The clouds came in. He was a novice pilot, but could fly, but he wasn't instrument rated. And then it got dark and the clouds came in, and the instruments were telling him which way was up, but he didn't trust it. He didn't believe it. And by the time he realized, he was in a nosedive and he couldn't pull up. And I said, I think that's depression. And I wrote that down, and it became Maggie's speech she gives in the pilot. She's the new friend in the group, and she turns out she's a psychologist specializing in depression, and she's trying to help these friends understand what happened. And for me, that was such a key to unlocking the show about like why today of the show. So I just love the idea of using an analogy as a way into something.
Okay, another question from somebody who is anonymous here, and there's a few questions that really touch on the Indigenous perspective, and knowing that I don't think any of us are experts, necessarily in that, but it's very important. They ask, it seems Western medicine is still in the early stages of exploring the use of psychedelics at the end of life, but many cultures have this practice woven into their fabric. Can you speak to the cultures that have held this practice and what we can learn from them? Or maybe just more, sort of in general about sort of the centuries old indigenous practice of using psychedelic medicine, and how this is all just very new for us.
Well, I can say a few things about that. It is true that other cultures have been using psychedelics for thousands of years. There's evidence of peyote use 6,000 years ago in the Rio Grande Valley. We don't know that they were being used around dying and death. They were used for a lot of reasons, sometimes for divination, looking for lost people or lost things, sometimes as a sacrament, a way to contact the divine. But I don't know, it'd be interesting if anybody in the audience knows and can write in whether we know that there are cultures that have used them around dying. Native Americans have been using peyote for a very long time. Psilocybin mushrooms were being used when the conquistadors got to Mexico. That was, and they called it the flesh of the gods. So they were using it as a sacrament, and that was crushed by the Spanish conquest and went underground for 500 years, and then was revealed to the West not till the 1950s. And in an amazing story, this amateur mycologist and banker at Chase, I forget the other part of the name of the company, but who had heard rumors that there was a mushroom cult in Mexico, and he went and found it and had a mushroom trip and wrote a cover story for Life magazine that introduced psychedelics to a lot of Americans in the 50s. So we come very late to the story in the West. And I think that's telling about what happened to psychedelics in the 60s. Here we had this powerful mind-changing substance, and it came without an instruction manual. There was, and that's why people started putting it in the punch bowl and using it in very reckless ways. Had we not been so arrogant and studied the way it was being used in other cultures, we would have surrounded it with the sort of rituals and practices and safeguards that they did. They had very specific ways of using psychedelics. It wasn't sloppy, and it was usually surrounded by ritual. Drugs in general, if their use is surrounded by ritual, there's a safety factor in that. And so I think we were just too arrogant. We are now paying a lot more attention to how indigenous cultures use psychedelics. I mean, the interest in ayahuasca is indicative of that. But there's a lot of wisdom out there about the proper use of these medicines that we could benefit from.
Yeah.
Well, I know, tag in one more time, and we knew it. We knew I'd come alive in the Q&A section, guys. We knew that's when it would happen. If you were a writer who is interested in that topic, and that's why you're asking that question, I do want to put a plug in for Hollywood Health and Society, because every time I've called them, and I usually start the call with, this is going to sound weird, but you know who they find someone I can talk to. And the two projects I'm working on now, they were an incredible resource, and that exists. And that's why this whole thing today is happening. Like, that is, you should reach out, because it's incredible. So if you think, oh, I would love to do a show about that and look at this, but I don't have the knowledge or the consultant or the background, you're one call away from it.
Yes, I echo that as well. Hollywood Health and Society, phenomenal. It's a little after 1, and while we would love to get to everybody's questions, we don't have the time, but we could do this again, in the future. And I guess in closing, I just want to say that if you like what you've heard today and you're interested in changing the cultural conversation about living and dying, please join us for Endwell 2024. It's a one-day TED-style conference in Los Angeles, November 22nd at the Skirball. At the conference, you hear from celebrities and patients and clinicians, artists, policy folks, faith leaders, and many more about how we can collectively make end of life a part of life. And our Attendees shockingly consistently tell us that it's one of the most powerful and inspiring days that they've had. So the link for that and more information should be in the chat shortly. And I just want to thank our incredible panel and all of you for joining us. Kate is going to come back on, but a huge thank you to USC's Hollywood Health and Society for hosting this conversation with us.
Thank you, Shoshana.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Shoshana.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
So hopefully we will see you again soon. Thank you all for joining us, and until next time.